His name was Elias Wray, 64 years old. 64 years on the same low ground his grandfather broke by hand, and on the morning they called him a fool, he did not raise his voice. He only rolled the old map tighter under his arm. They mocked him in front of the whole rent-day room. 40 tenants. Every one of them heard it. He had refused to drain 40 acres of meadow, 40 acres his father had kept flooded on purpose, year after year, for a reason no ledger could hold. The new land agent lifted that map. Elias's father had inked it by hand, the blue flood line drawn after the Great Water of 1839. The agent held it up so the whole room could see, and he laughed. "A child's watercolour," he said. Then cold, "The Slake is drained by Michaelmas, Mr. Wray, or you find another parish." But that autumn Elias had seen things the agent's instruments could not. The willows silvering 3 weeks early, the swifts flying low, skimming the water, the damp climbing the churchyard stone. And one night, while the village slept, he carried a spade down to the old flood hatch alone. He told no one why. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this old meadow travels. Now, let me tell you how it happened. Nether Cleeve sits in a low green fold of Somerset, where the River Cardell loops slow around the last of the good arable. It is 1874. The lanes are mud and stone. The church is grey, and below all of it, lower than the road, lower than the mill, lower than every cottage in the parish, sits Ockwell Farm. 3 generations of Wrays had farmed that low ground. Elias's grandfather broke the first field there with an ox and a wooden plough. His father Silas held it after. And now, Elias, 64 years old, and his back still straight enough for the hay. Beside the farmhouse, past the good arable, lay the Slake. 40 acres of water meadow, rushes and slow water and long green grass that grew where nothing else would. To a stranger, it looked like waste. Idle land, water sitting where a crop ought to be. It was not waste. It was the most important ground in the parish, and only the Wrays understood why. When the Cardell rose, and the Cardell always rose, every few winters, sometimes worse, the river needed somewhere to go. The Slake drank it. 40 acres of low meadow took the flood and held it, spread it thin and shallow, and kept it off the village street and off the good higher fields. Silas Wray used to stand at the edge of it and say, "My father's water." He meant the flood belonged there. He meant it had a place to sleep. Inside the farmhouse, on the wall by the hearth, hung the map. Silas had drawn it himself. Pen and ink on a square of linen-backed paper, faded now to the colour of weak tea. It showed the loop of the Cardell and the 40 acres and the old carriers, the little channels that fed the flood in and let it out slow, and running through it, a single blue line. The flood line. The height the great water had reached in 1839, marked and remembered. Elias touched it sometimes, passing, not with any ceremony. Just 2 fingers on the corner, the way you'd touch a gatepost you'd leaned on all your life. "My father's water," he'd say, half to himself. His granddaughter Grace thought it a faded old picture. 19 years old and quick, she had grown up with that map on the wall the way you grow up with the crack in the ceiling. It meant nothing to her. A grandfather's keepsake, a blue smudge on brown paper. She had never once asked what the line was for. Elias's rent was £52 a year. In 40 years, he had never been late. Not once. Not the year the barley failed, not the year his wife died. £52, on the day, every year, quiet as clockwork. That should have been enough. For a long time, it was. Then the old baronet died, and everything changed. Sir Aubrey Fenwick was 28. He came into the title and the estate and the great house all in one spring, and with them a debt, £4,200, owed to the Wessex and County Bank, secured against the very land his tenants farmed. The old baronet had borrowed and never told him how much. Now the whole of it came due at Michaelmas, the 29th of September. Elias could have told him to the day. Aubrey was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one, though he'd have died before he said so. He looked at his father's ledgers and saw only red ink and a date coming toward him like a tide. He needed the rents up, he needed the debt cleared, and he did not know his own land well enough to know what he was standing on. So he hired Josiah Crake. Crake was 35, and he called himself a scientific land agent. He came from the north with a case of instruments and a book of rent tables and a way of looking at a field as if it owed him money. He measured everything. He wrote everything down. He believed, deep in his bones, that any ground could be improved by a man who understood figures, and that any ground that resisted was simply waiting for a cleverer man. He rode out over the estate in his first week, and he found the Slake. 40 acres, sitting idle, sitting wet, growing nothing but rushes and grass, and a few slow cattle to the acre. To Crake it was an insult, a waste. Money lying in the mud. He drew up his plan that same night, and he was proud of it. Cut a straight drain from the Slake to the Cardell. Tile drain the whole 40 acres. Take out the water, let the ground dry and firm, and turn it to arable. Wheat, barley, real crops on real fields. 40 acres of new arable meant £190 more rent a year, every year, for as long as the estate stood. The work would cost £640 to do, but against £190 a year, it paid for itself inside 4 seasons, and after that, it was pure gain. On paper, it was beautiful. On paper, it saved Sir Aubrey Fenwick. Crake took his figures to the great house and laid them out, and Aubrey, drowning in his father's debt, saw a raft and grabbed it. £190 a year, toward the 4,200 he owed. It was the first good news he'd had since the funeral. He did not ride down to look at the Slake himself. He did not ask the man who had farmed it for 40 years. He looked at Crake's neat columns, and the neat columns looked back, and that was enough. Rent day came at the end of that week. It was held in the long room at the estate office, the way it always had been. 40 tenants and their hats in their hands, a fire in the grate. Crake behind the table now, where the old steward used to sit, with his ledger open and his pen ready. Sir Aubrey stood by the window, young and stiff in his black coat, watching. They came up one at a time. Name, rent, mark in the book, and on to the next. Crake had added something new that season, a drainage clause, a line at the bottom of each agreement saying the tenant consented to whatever improvements the estate saw fit to make upon his holding. Most men signed it without reading. They'd have signed their own hanging that day if it kept the roof over their heads. Then Elias Wray came up. He set his £52 on the table, counted out, exact. Crake marked it. Then Crake turned the paper and pointed to the clause with the end of his pen. "Your mark there, Mr. Wray, the drainage consent." Elias looked at it. He read it slow, the way he read everything, moving his lips a little the way old men do. Then he set the pen down where he'd found it. "No," he said, "I'll not sign that one." The room, which had been a low murmur, went quiet. Crake smiled. He had been waiting for this, and a part of him was glad. "You understand the clause concerns the Slake, the water meadow. It's to be drained and brought into crop." "I understand it," Elias said. "That's why I won't sign. 40 acres of standing water, Mr. Wray, growing rushes, in the year of our Lord 1874. Crake let that hang, and a few of the younger men laughed, because it did sound foolish, said like that. It's to be tiled and drained and made to earn its keep. Same as every acre on this estate. That ground earns its keep, Elias said. It's been earning it since before you were born. only not in a way your book can weigh. And what way is that? Elias did not answer at once. He was not a man who spoke to fill a silence. He reached under his arm and took out the thing he had carried in with him. The map. His father's map, rolled tight, the linen backing soft with age. He unrolled it there on the table, over the ledger, and smoothed it with the flat of his hand. "My father drew this," he said, "after the flood of 39. This blue line here, that's how high the water came. Chest high in the church it was, drowned 3 below the mill. My father kept the Slake open on purpose from that day, so the river'd have somewhere to lie down when it rose. 40 acres to drink the flood. That's what that ground is for. It's not a field. It's a door for the water." For a moment, nobody laughed. Then Craik reached out and picked up the map by one corner, and held it up, turned it toward the room, and looked at it the way a schoolmaster looks at a poor boy's sum. "This," he said, "you'd set this against my survey. Against a level and a chain and a proper instrument." He gave a short laugh and lifted it higher so the back rows could see the faded blue, a child's watercolour. The room laughed with him. 40 men, and most of them laughed, because he was the agent and Elias was only Elias, and because a man laughs where he's told to when his own roof depends on it. Grace was there, at the back, come to walk her grandfather home. She heard the whole room laugh at her grandfather's map, and she felt her face go hot, and she looked at the floor. She did not say a word. Elias stood very still through it. He did not reach for the map. He did not raise his voice. He let them laugh themselves out. And when it was quiet again, he put out his hand, and Craik, a little surprised, a little disappointed, gave the map back. Elias rolled it up, slow and careful, corner to corner, and put it under his arm where it had been. Craik leaned forward. He'd meant to be reasonable. Now he only wanted it done. "Let me be plain with you, since plainness is what you want. I deal in figures, not folklore. The Slake is drained by Michaelmas, Missa, Wray, or you find another parish. That's the whole of it." Elias looked at him a long moment. Then he looked past him, at young Sir Aubrey by the window, who had gone pale and said nothing at all. And then Elias picked up his hat. "Water keeps its own accounts," he said. "Quiet, not angry. The way a man states a fact about the weather. You'll find that out. I only hope the village doesn't find it out with you." And he turned and walked out, past his silent granddaughter, into the grey afternoon. That night, in the great house, Sir Aubrey Fenwick sat a long while with Craik's plan in front of him and the old man's words in his ears. Water keeps its own accounts. He didn't know what it meant. He didn't like not knowing. But he had £4,200 coming due, and 190 a year sitting right there in Craik's neat hand, and a frightened man will always trust the figure over the face. He signed the drainage order before he went up to bed. Craik took it from him still wet. The gangs came 3 days later. Elias heard them before he saw them. The clink of tile, the ring of spades, men's voices carrying across the low ground in the morning cold. He walked up from the farmhouse to the edge of the Slake and stood at the gate and watched. They came onto his father's water like an army onto a field. Craik had hired 30 men and a foreman and cartloads of clay pipe stacked white along the headland. They set to work driving a straight cut, dead straight, string and peg straight, from the middle of the Slake toward the river. A modern drain. A channel to carry the water out and away so the ground could dry. And they went at the old system too. The carriers, the little winding channels Silas had cut by hand, that let the flood in slow and out slow, they filled them in, spade by spade, as things of no use. And the old flood hatch, the ancient wooden gate at the low corner where the Slake met the river, the gate 3 rays had raised and lowered by the season to let the water breathe. They dragged a chain through it and locked it shut. Chained it fast. A relic. A bit of rotten timber in the way of progress. Elias watched them fill his father's carriers. He watched them chain the hatch. He stood at the gate with his hands loose at his sides, and he did not say one word. Some of the village came out to watch too over the next days, and God help them, a good many of them cheered it. It was exciting. It was new. 40 acres of useless bog turned to good wheat land. Craig had made sure the story went round like that. The Fenwick estate was being improved. The North Countryman knew his business. And there was old Wray, standing at his gate like a scarecrow, too stubborn or too soft in the head to see it. Grace heard them say so. She heard it at the well and outside the church. "Your grandfather," a neighbour said to her, not unkindly, "he wants to come into the new age. Grace, man can't farm water." And Grace, who loved him, and who was 19, and who was tired of being the girl whose grandfather was laughed at, Grace did not defend him. She held her tongue and looked away and let it pass, and hated herself a little for it, and did it anyway. That was the low point. If you'd stood at the gate of the Slake that week, you'd have said it was over. The old man beaten. The old way undone, his father's careful water torn up and thrown down and chained, and 2 questions hanging over Ockwell Farm like the coming autumn cloud. Would they turn him out? And would his own granddaughter ever stand beside him again? But something was happening in those weeks that Craig's instruments could not measure. And Elias, who had eyes for nothing else, was watching it come. It began with the willows. The willows down the riverbank went silver early, 3 weeks early. Elias saw it on a walk one grey morning, the leaves turning their pale undersides up to the sky, the whole line of them gone from green to silver, as if a wind were on them, only there was no wind. He stood and looked at that a long time. His father had taught him to read it. When the willows silver before their season, they've felt the water coming. There's more wet in the ground than the sky has any right to show yet. Then the swifts. There were still a few swifts about, late in the year as it was, and Elias watched them of an evening. They flew low, low over the Slake, low over the river, skimming so close to the water their wingtips near cut it. High swifts, high flies, dry weather, low swifts, low flies, wet weather coming, and soon. He had known it since he was a boy Grace's age, and it had never once lied to him. Then the river itself. The Cardell ran wrong-coloured, not the clear brown of a settled autumn river, a paler, milkier brown, water that had come from somewhere it hadn't been before. Water gathering off the high moor faster than the season should send it. Elias filled his hand with it at the ford and let it run out and looked at what it left, and his mouth went tight. And the floodstone. Down in the churchyard stood an old stone, older than the church almost, and low on it, chest high, was the mark. A groove cut and lead filled, and beside it a date, 1839, the height of the great flood. Old Pardo, the parish clerk, kept it, cleared the moss off it every year, entered the parish floods in his book against it. Elias went down and laid his hand flat on the stone below the mark, and the stone was wet. Not rained on wet. Wet from within, the damp risen up through it from the ground, cold and living under his palm. His father had shown him that too. When the flood stone weeps before the rains, the water's already deep in the earth, only waiting. Every sign he had was pointing the same way. Not wet weather may come. Every farmer knew that in autumn. No, the signs were saying flood. A great one. The kind that came once in a generation, the kind his father had drawn a blue line for, and they had just torn out the one thing in the whole parish built to hold it. He went to warn them. He walked up to the new cut on a raw afternoon, where Craig stood with his level and 2 of his men sighting down the dead-straight channel. Elias took off his hat, which he did for no man he didn't respect, only because he wanted to be heard. "Mr. Craig," a word. Craig straightened from the instrument and looked at him with something close to pleasure. "Come to sign, have you? Come to tell you to stop." Or if you'll not stop, then leave the hatch. The old hatch, at the low corner. Leave me that one gate. That's all I ask. And why would I leave a rotten door in the middle of a drained field? Because the water's coming, Elias said. This autumn, a big one. The willows have silvered, the swifts are flying low, the river's running off the moor wrong-coloured, and the floodstone's weeping in the churchyard. Every sign I've got says the Cardell's going to come up over its banks, and when it does, this ground you've dried is where it means to go. You've filled the carriers. You've chained the door. Where's it to go now but the village? Craik listened to all of it with his head tilted, the way a man listens to a child's story to be polite. And when it was done, he did not shout. He did something worse. He turned to his ledger, open on a plank across 2 trestles, and he tapped it. Willows, he said, and swifts. And a weeping stone. He said it to his 2 men as much as to Elias, and one of them grinned. Mr. Wray, I have here the rainfall figures for this valley across 30 years. I have the fall of this land measured to the inch. I have the width and depth of this cut calculated to carry off more water than the Cardell has raised in living memory. That is what tells me what the water will do. Not a bird. Not a wet rock. A number. He shut the book. You've had your word. Good day. And Sir Aubrey Fenwick was there. He had ridden down to see the work, sitting his horse a little apart, and he heard the whole of it. He heard the old man's willows and swifts, and he heard Craik's 30 years of figures, and he watched Elias put his hat back on and walk away. And Aubrey, God forgive him, he was young and he was frightened, and he wanted so badly for the figures to be right, Aubrey said nothing to call the old man back. That was twice now they'd laughed him down. Twice, in front of witnesses. And the second time, the man who could have stopped it all sat his horse and let it happen. But someone else heard. That same week. Old Pardo, the parish clerk, met Grace by the churchyard wall, and he was troubled, and he did not hide it. Your grandfather came down to the stone, he told her, laid his hand on it. I've known Elias Wray 60-year girl, and I never saw his face like that. He took her by the sleeve. Come, I'll show you what he saw. He led her in among the leaning graves to the old floodstone, and he brushed the moss from the mark with his thumb, and he made her stand beside it. The groove came to the middle of her chest. To the middle of her chest. That's how high the water stood, Pardo said, in 39. Right through this churchyard, over the graves, up the village street. Chest high. And you know what stood between that flood and the worst of it? The Slake, 40 acres of your family's water meadow, drinking it down. Silas Wray drew the line on that stone with his own hand and drew it on his map at home, and he kept that meadow open every year of his life, so it never come chest high again. He looked at her hard. And now they've drained it. And your grandfather can read the sky, and the sky is saying 39 is coming back. Grace stood with the cold stone against her, at the height the water would rise, and something turned over in her. She thought of the map on the wall she'd called a faded picture. She thought of her grandfather at the rent day, letting the whole room laugh, rolling that map up slow and careful, and saying nothing. She thought of herself at the back of the room, looking at the floor, and she was ashamed, but a different shame now. Not shame of him, shame of herself. She walked home the long way, past the Slake, and she stood at the gate where he stood, and she looked at the dead straight cut, and the white pipe stacked along the headland, and the chained hatch at the low corner, and for the first time in her life she tried to see it the way he saw it. Not a bog made good, a door torn off its hinges with the storm already on the road. She went in that evening and found him at the table, and the map was down off the wall, spread flat under the lamp, weighted at the corners with 2 stones off the windowsill. He was studying it, tracing the old carriers with one finger, the ones they'd filled in, following the blue line. "Grandfather," she said. He didn't look up. "Grace, that map. She sat down across from him. "Tell me what it says. All of it. I want to know." For the first time in a long time, the old man looked at his granddaughter as if she'd come back from somewhere. He turned the lamp up a little, and he began to show her. This is the loop of the river. This is where it breaks its bank first, always here at the elbow. This is the low corner, and this is the hatch, the door, and these winding lines. These are the carriers that let the water in gentle and let it out slow. And this blue line, this is my father's water. This is how high, and this is why we never ever fill the Slake. She listened to all of it. And she believed it. Late, and ashamed of how late, but she believed it whole. "Then we have to make them open it again," she said. "Tell Sir Aubrey. Tell the village. If the water's coming, they won't hear it." He said it without bitterness. You saw them at the rent day. You heard them at the well. They've made up their minds, and a man that's cheering doesn't want to be told the joke's on him. He rolled the map a little straighter under the stones. "No, there's no talking left in it. There's only doing." "Doing what?" He didn't answer that. Not then. He folded the map away and told her to get to her bed, and she went, and lay awake a long while listening to the first thin rain start against the glass. But Elias did not go to his bed. He waited until the house was still and the lamp in Grace's window had gone out. Then he took the map down again and rolled it and put on his heavy coat, and he took his spade off the wall by the door. The good long spade, worn thin at the edge from 40 years of his hand. And he went out into the wet dark, down toward the low corner of the Slake. Alone, he was not going to fight the drain. He knew he couldn't. 30 men had made the cut, and it was made. He was one old man with one spade and one night. He couldn't put back 40 acres of carriers. He couldn't unmake what Craig had done to the whole meadow, but he could keep one door. Down at the low corner where the Slake met the river stood the old flood hatch, chained shut by the gangs, timber and iron gone green with the years, but still sound, still hung true on its posts the way Silas had hung it. If the Cardell rose the way the willows said it would, and the straight cut carried that surge the wrong way, down into the village instead of away from it, because a straight drain runs both directions, and Craig had never once thought which way the water would choose, then this one gate, freed, could throw the river back. Back onto Elias's own low meadow, his own boundary, his own 40 acres of ground he was ready to give up to the water to keep it off the 11 cottages and the mill and the church. One sacrificial door. One meadow given, on purpose, the way his father would have given it. Not to win the argument, to save the village while the village was still laughing at him. He knelt in the wet grass at the corner and spread the map on the ground and weighted it with 4 stones, and he set the lamp beside it low, hooded, so no light would carry up to the house or the road. And he read it in the dark and the rain, his father's blue line, his father's hand, and then he took up the spade. First the chain. It was passed twice through the timbers and locked with a padlock, but the staple it hung from was old, driven into wood 100 years soft. He worked the spade edge behind it and leaned his whole weight, 64 years of it, and the wood gave with a wet tearing sound, and the staple came away, chain and lock and all, into the mud. He stood breathing for a moment with the rain on his face. Then he set the chain aside where it wouldn't foul the gate, and he put his hands on the old timber and he tried the hatch. It moved, stiff, groaning, half a lifetime since it was last worked, but it moved. Hung true. His father's joinery, holding yet. Then he began to dig, a length of the old carrier, the one they'd filled, right here on his own boundary to feed the freed hatch, so that when the gate was opened the water would have its road onto his meadow and not just stand and back up useless against the fill. He set the spade to the packed clay the gangs had thrown in, and he lifted it and threw it and set it again. Slow, steady, an old man's pace, that doesn't stop. The rain came harder and ran down his neck, and he did not feel it. The lamp burned low and hooded. The map lay open under its 4 stones, the blue line gleaming wet, guiding the spade in the dark. He told no one he was doing it. Not Grace. Not Pardo. No one. If it worked, they need never know the village had been an old man's meadow away from ruin. If it didn't work, if the storm came bigger than even his father had drawn, if the freed hatch jammed, if the river came over everything, then it wouldn't matter who knew. He dug until his hands were raw inside his gloves, and a grey light began to think about the eastern sky. And then he shouldered the spade and picked up the map and the lamp and went home, muddy to the waist, and let himself in quiet, and no one stirred. Up on the estate, that same week, Craik wrote his report in a clean, dry hand and signed it with a flourish. The Slake, he wrote, was reclaimed. 40 acres brought from waste to arable. The rent uplift of £190 per annum might be entered against the estate's account from the coming Lady Day and applied toward the Michaelmas obligation to the Wessex and County Bank. He was, he wrote, the estate's obedient servant. He was rather pleased with himself. And out beyond his lamplit window, in the dark he never thought to look into, the rain that had started thin was settling into something with weight behind it. The Cardell was rising off the high moor, wrong-coloured, gathering. The willows had silvered 3 weeks early, and they had not lied. The swifts were gone now, fled south ahead of it, and at the low corner of a drained meadow, an old man's freed gate hung waiting on its true hung-posts, greased with rain. Its chain in the mud, a single door left open against the whole of Josiah Craik's arithmetic. Nobody knew it was there but Elias Wray. And the water was coming to keep its accounts. The rain came on the Tuesday and did not stop. It was not a hard rain at first. It was the kind that looks like nothing from a window. Fine and grey and steady. The kind a man in a dry office calls a wet spell and thinks no more about. Craik thought no more about it. He had his report signed and his figures entered, and his mind already on the Michaelmas payment and the good opinion of Sir Aubrey Fenwick. But Elias stood in his yard on the Wednesday morning and watched the Cardell, and he did not like what he saw. The river had turned the colour of weak tea gone cold, brown and thick and moving faster than a low river should. It carried things: a gate bar, a drowned hen, a tangle of bright willow leaves torn down 3 weeks before their time. He watched a whole hurdle go by, turning slow in the current, and he knew what a hurdle in the river meant. It meant water was already up in the high fields on the moor. It meant what was coming down was only the front of it. He went in and took his coat off the peg and put it straight back on. "Grace," he said, "get your boots." She came out with her hair still down and her face soft with sleep, and she looked at the river, and something in her went still. She had seen the floodstone now. She had stood in the churchyard with old Pardo and put her own hand against the mark, chest high on a grown man, and heard the clerk say quiet, "This was the water your great-grandfather drew." She was not ashamed of the old man any longer. She was frightened for him, and with him, which is a different thing. "Is it coming?" she said. "It's coming." He did not say more than that. He never did. But he moved that day like a man half his age, and she moved with him, and between them they did the work that no scientific plan had thought to do. First the ricks. He had 4 of them. 4 seasons of hay stood up dry against the winter, and they sat on the middle ground where they had always sat, because in his father's day the middle ground was safe. It was not safe now. The Slake was drained. The washland that used to drink the flood was tiled and straight cut and full of green wheat, and the water that used to spread wide and shallow over 40 acres had nowhere to go but down the cut and into everything below it. So they moved the hay, by hand, by cart, fork by fork, up onto the top pasture where the ground rose toward the church. It took them till noon, and their backs were done, and the rain never once let up. Grace's hands blistered and broke, and she said nothing about them. She had watched her grandfather stand quiet and take his mocking at the rent day, and she understood now what quiet cost, and she would not spend her breath complaining about a little skin. Then the cottages. There were 11 of them along the low lane where it ran toward the mill. 11 doors that sat barely a foot above the old floodline, kept dry all these years by a meadow their people had forgotten was working for them. Elias took the lamp, though it was day, because the sky had gone so dark it might as well have been dusk, and he went door to door in the rain. Some laughed at him. "The agent says it's drained, Elias," reclaimed, he says. 40 new acres of good arable. You heard him same as us. I heard him, Elias said. Put your good things upstairs tonight. Your papers, your grandmother's chairs, anything the water would spoil. The agent has never seen the water up. I have. Put your things up high and sleep with your boots by the bed. And he went on to the next door, and the next, and he did not argue with any of them past the once. He said his say plain and moved along. That was his way. He would not beg a man to save himself. But some listened. Widow Truelove listened, because she was old too and remembered the wet years. The miller listened, because a miller lives closer to the water than anyone, and had felt his wheel running strange all morning. One by one, along that low lane, a few upstairs windows began to fill with the shapes of chairs and chests carried up out of the flood's reach, while the fine grey rain came down, and the Cardell rose another hand's breadth. And another. At the great house they were dressing for dinner, Sir Aubrey Fenwick stood at his window with a glass of something warm and watched the rain streak the panes, and thought it a dreary evening and nothing worse. He was 28, and new to his troubles. £4,200 his father had left him, owed to the Wessex and County Bank, falling due at Michaelmas on the 29th of September, now very near, and against it Craig had promised him £190 a year of new rent off the reclaimed Slake, and a debt paid down the modern, scientific way. He trusted Craig. Craig had tables. Craig had figures ruled in clean columns. The old tenant on the low farm had only a faded blue picture and a stubborn silence. And Aubrey had let himself be taught to see the one as sense and the other as folly. He did not know that his whole account was about to be recast in a currency he had never learned to read. Down at Ockwell, as the dark came on for real, Elias took his long spade from the wall by the door. "Stay in," he told Grace. "No," she said. He looked at her, 19 years old, her grandmother's chin, her mother's eyes, and something of his own father in the set of her mouth that he had never noticed until this year. He might have ordered her. Once he would have. But she had stood by the floodstone and come home believing, and he found he could not send her in. "Then keep the lamp up and your feet out of the low corner," he said. "When I tell you back, you come back. You don't stop to think about it." They went down together into the wet dark, to the low corner where the Slake met the Cardell, where the old flood hatch hung on its true posts, with its chain in the mud where he had left it. And they got there just in time to watch the river make its first move against the village. It came up over the far bank first, where Craig's straight cut let it in. That was the thing the plan had never reckoned. The old system spread the flood wide and slow across 40 acres of willing meadow and let it soak away gentle. The new cut was a road, a clean, straight, deep-tiled road, dug to carry water out fast, and a road runs two ways. When the Cardell topped its bank up above, the flood did not spread. It found the cut, and it poured down it like a mill race, straight and hard and gathering speed, aimed like a loaded gun at the low arable and the 11 cottages and the mill and the whole sleeping length of Nether Cleeve. Elias saw the water take the cut, and he understood in one breath everything Craig had built. He had made the flood worse. He had taken the break off the river and pointed it at the houses. The hatch, Elias said. Now, but the hatch would not come. It should have swung. He had freed it himself, pried the chain off the staple, worked it loose on its posts, greased it with a week of rain. It should have opened at a push, and let the river spill sideways onto his own drained meadow, onto the Slake, to spread and slow and drown his ground instead of the village. That was the whole of his plan. One gate. One sacrifice. His 40 acres for their 11 doors. But the storm had filled the low corner with wrack. Branches and hurdles and a whole drowned tree had come down the swollen Cardell and jammed hard against the timber, and the water pressing behind it had wedged the whole raft of it into the gateway so the hatch could not swing for the weight against it. Elias got his hands to the top rail and heaved, and the gate gave a finger's width and no more. The river shoved back, cold to the chest now, rising while they stood in it. Grandfather, Grace's voice, high over the noise of the water. "The tree," he shouted. "Get a rope on the tree. We pull it clear, the gate comes." She was quick. She was young and quick, where he was strong and slow, and between them it was almost enough. She got the rope round the drowned trunk, and they hauled, the two of them, boots sliding in the drowned meadow, the water climbing, the lamp swung up on the hatch post, throwing wild shadows over black moving water, and the tree shifted, and jammed again, and the river came up another hand, and Elias felt the ground trying to lift his feet from under him, and knew they had a minute, perhaps two, before it would have them both. He thought, for one clear cold second, that his father's map had been right, and it would not matter, because they would drown here at the open gate, and the water would take the village anyway. Then Grace went into the water. She let go the rope, and she went down into the black at the foot of the gate, where the tree was wedged, right down under, her hands in the rack, and Elias roared her name into the rain, and she came up gasping with the broken end of a branch in her fist that had been the pin holding the whole jam, and she flung it clear, and the drowned tree turned, slow and slid, and went. The hatch swung. It swung wide on its true hung posts, the way Elias Wray had hung it 35 years before, and the Cardell found the open door and turned. Elias felt it more than saw it, the great cold shove of it easing sideways past him, off the straight murderous line of the cut, and out, wide, over his own drained meadow, over the Slake, spreading as it had always spread, slowing as it had always slowed, laying itself out shallow and broad over 40 acres of his ground that no longer had a crop to lose because the tiles and the plough had already lost it for him. He caught Grace by the collar and hauled her up onto the higher ground, and they lay in the wet grass and the driving rain and watched the water take the meadow instead of the village. And neither of them could speak, and the rain came down, and the old flood hatch stood open behind them, doing the one thing it had been made and kept and freed to do. They did not sleep that night. They sat in the farmhouse doorway, wrapped in what was dry, and watched the dark and listened, and toward the small hours the rain thinned and eased, and by the grey of dawn it had stopped, and the storm that men would talk of for the rest of their lives had blown itself out over the sea. Then came the morning, and the village went down to look at what the water had done. They came out of their houses in the thin grey light, the 11 cottages that had kept their feet dry, the miller whose wheel still stood, the widow who had carried her chairs upstairs on the word of a stubborn old man. They came down the low lane to the edge of the water, and they stopped, and they looked, and no one said anything at all. Because you could read it plain. You did not need a surveyor to read it, though a surveyor would come. On the one side, the modern side, Crake's reclaimed acres, the straight cut, the tiled arable, the £190 of new rent, lay drowned, deep and brown and ruined, the young wheat gone under, the clean straight drain choked and burst, 40 acres of scientific improvement, 4 feet deep in the river it had been dug to master. And on the other side, past the low corner, over Elias's ground, the water lay too, but shallow, spread wide and thin and quiet over the Slake, exactly to the line his father had drawn in blue ink 35 years before. It had gone where it was meant to go. It had done what the meadow was for. And between the two, dry, stood the village. The lane. The mill. The 11 doors. They stood at the water's edge and looked from the drowned modern fields to the shallow saving meadow and back, and the silence among them was the whole verdict. No one cheered. Cheering would have been a small thing beside what they were looking at. They only stood and understood, one by one, what the quiet old man had known, and they had laughed at, and how near they had all come. Then the miller turned and walked up the lane to Ockwell Farm and knocked at the door, and took off his hat when Elias opened it, which the miller had never done to any man. And behind the miller, in ones and twos through that grey morning, came the cottagers. They did not make speeches. They were not speech-making people. They came to the yard and stood, and some gripped his hand, and the widow Trulove kissed his rough cheek and cried. And old Pardo, the parish clerk, came last of all, and just stood beside Elias looking out at the water, 2 old men who had both known, and said only, "Your father drew it true." "He did," said Elias. "He always did. By midday the county had sent a man. Mr. Ledbury was a surveyor, called out to assess the damage and cost it up for the insurers and the estate, and he came expecting a routine ruin, a burst drain, a lost crop, a sum to be entered and paid. He walked the drowned cut and the flooded arable with his notebook and his measuring chain, and his face got longer as he went, because he was a man who knew water, and he could see that this flood had been made worse by the very works dug to prevent it. And then someone fetched the map. Grace fetched it. She took it down from the wall by the hearth, where it had hung all her life, the hand-inked linen her great-grandfather had drawn after the great water of 1839, the one Craik had held up before 40 tenants and called a child's watercolour. She carried it down to the low corner where Ledbury stood, and she laid it on the top of a barrel. And she weighted its corners with 4 stones the way her grandfather had weighted it in the dark, and she said, "Sir, you should see this against the water." Ledbury looked at it a long moment. Then he looked at the waterline, the wet dark stain the flood had left across the ground as it began to fall. Then he took his chain and he measured, and he checked it against the map, and against the floodstone in the churchyard that Pardo brought him to, the stone with the lead-filled groove cut at the height of the 1839 flood, the blue line on the linen, the stain on the ground, the mark on the stone. They matched. To the yard, they matched. 35 years apart, a river had risen to the same height twice, and an old man's father had drawn where it would go with a pen and a straight eye and a memory, and he had been right to the yard. Ledbury straightened up slowly and folded his notebook, and when Sir Aubrey Fenwick came down at last to see his ruin for himself, the surveyor met him at the barrel with the map still weighted under its 4 stones. "Sir Aubrey," Ledbury said, "do you know what this meadow was?" "Waste ground," Aubrey said. "Water meadow. My agent had it reclaimed." "It was your washland." Ledbury put his finger on the blue line, and then he pointed out at the shallow water lying quiet over the Slake. 40 acres kept to drink your floods and hold them off the village. 3 generations of these people kept it so. Your agent drained it and cut a straight channel to the river, and last night that channel did not carry the flood away. It carried it down, into your cottages, into your mill. It would have taken the whole of Nether Cleeve, sir, and lives with it, but for that. And he nodded at the old flood hatch, standing open at the low corner, the chain still in the mud. One gate, left open by someone who knew what your agent did not. This map is not a picture, Sir Aubrey. This map is the truest survey of this ground I have seen in 30 years of the trade. I could not have drawn it better with an instrument. Sir Aubrey Fenwick stood in the wet and looked at the blue line and at the water and at the drowned acres of his own reclaimed rent, and he was a young man, but he was not a stupid one, and you could see the moment the whole account turned over in his head into the other currency and came out ruinous. He had it reckoned by that evening in the estate office, with the ledger open and Craik standing before the desk. £640 spent to dig the drainage, gone under the water it caused. The £190 a year of new rent, gone with the drowned crop and the burst tiles that would cost near as much again to make good. The whole low harvest of the estate, ruined, 11 cottages to repair, and the mill, and every claim their people would bring. All of it, set against, and here Aubrey turned back the pages of the ledger with his own hand, set against £52 a year. The rent of the tenant he had been within a breath of turning out of the parish. £52 a year, never once late in 40 years, from the one man on the whole estate who had told him the truth. "You brought me figures," Aubrey said to Craik. He did not shout. He was too tired and too shaken to shout. "You brought me a plan and a rent table and a great deal of contempt for a man who could not argue for himself. And every figure you brought me is now under 4 feet of river. Have you anything to say?" Craik had drawn himself up. He was 35 and clever, and he had built a small name on schemes like this one, and he was not a man to go under gracefully. "The storm was exceptional," he said. "No plan could have foreseen. A plan foresaw it." Aubrey put his hand flat on the linen map which Grace had carried up to the great house at Ledbury's asking, and which now lay on the estate desk beside the drainage order Craik had drawn. It foresaw it 35 years ago, and drew it in blue ink and hung it on a wall, and you held it up in front of 40 people and called it a child's watercolour. You told my tenant you dealt in figures, not folklore. Aubrey looked up. "Well, here are your figures, Mr. Craik. Read them back to me." And Josiah Craik, who dealt in figures, stood before the ruined ledger and had nothing at all to say. There is a kind of silence that a proud man cannot bear, and it is the silence of his own words handed back to him empty. He stood in it a moment. Then he gathered his papers, what were left of them, and he left the office, and within the week he had left the parish, and folk said afterward, those who kept up with such things, that he had drained better meadows than this one, though when you pressed them, no one could ever name quite where. Sir Aubrey did not go to bed that night. He sat with the ledger a long time. And in the morning he rode down to Ockwell Farm himself, alone, with the drainage order in his coat. The 40 were there. Not summoned. They had simply come, the way people do the morning after a great thing, the same 40 tenants who had stood in the rent-day room and watched the map called a watercolour and watched the old man take his mocking without a word. They stood now in the yard at Ockwell in the wet grey morning, and they watched their baronet climb down off his horse and go to the old man who was, at that very moment, forking hay off the top of the high pasture where he and Grace had carried it in the rain. Elias came down when he saw who it was. He came down slow, and he stood, and he waited, because it was not his way to speak first to his landlord. "Mr. Wray," said Sir Aubrey Fenwick, and he took off his hat, there in the yard, in front of the 40. "I have come to tell you that I was wrong, and that you were right, and that this village stands this morning because of you, and I did not deserve that of you after the way you were used at my table. Your rent is yours at £52, as it has always been. The drainage clause is struck, and the care of the Slake is put back into your hands by covenant, yours and your family's, for as long as there are rays to keep it, that it may be kept as your fathers kept it. I cannot make the rest right, but I can do that, and I have come to thank you." And here was the whole weight of it, the thing the whole story had been walking toward. And Elias Wray had every right in the world to say a hard, true word, to turn the mockery back on the men who had mocked, to stand in that yard before the 40 and let them see him proved right, and let it cost the proud their pride. He did not. He looked at the young man with his hat in his hands, and he looked past him at the 40 faces he had known all his life, and at the water still lying shallow and quiet over his father's meadow, doing its old slow work. And he said the only thing he ever said about any of it, the thing he had said at the rent day, quiet, when they laughed at him. Water keeps its own accounts. That was all. He did not say, "I told you." He did not name the agent who was gone, or the neighbours who had laughed, or the granddaughter who had once looked away. He touched his cap to his landlord, and he turned, and he went back up the pasture to fork the rest of his hay into the dry, because it was morning, and there was work, and the hay would not wait on any man's thanks. And that, the not saying, the plain back turned to fork the hay, that was what undid the 40. A gloating man they could have borne. It would have let them off. But the old man, simply going back to his work, having saved every one of them, and asking nothing, said nothing they could answer, and more than one of them went home that morning quieter than they had come. Grace stood in the farmhouse doorway and watched him go up the field. Then she went inside, and she took the map down from the wall, the linen, the blue line, her great-grandfather's straight true hand, and she carried it to the window and got a cloth and a little warm water, and she cleaned the glass of the frame, gentle, corner to corner, the way you clean a thing you have finally understood the worth of. She had looked away from it once. She had thought it a faded picture, and thought her grandfather a stubborn old fool, and been ashamed to stand beside him in a rent-day room. She was not ashamed now. She would never be ashamed again. She wiped the glass clean, and she hung it back on its nail by the hearth, and she stood and looked at it a while, and then she went to find paper, because there was a thing she had decided to do. The spring came, as springs do, and the water went down off the low ground, and the drowned acres slowly dried, and the estate was mended the slow way, cottage by cottage, tile by tile, out of a debt met not by clever schemes, but by keeping what worked and selling nothing that held. Sir Aubrey paid his £4,200 to the Wessex and County Bank in the end, later than he had meant to, and harder than he had hoped, but he paid it, and he learned a thing about his own ground in the paying that no rent table had ever taught him, which was to ride down and look at it, and to listen to the old men who farmed it, before he signed away what he did not understand. And the Slake came green. By April it lay as it had always lain, in the years before Crake, before the tiles and the straight cut, 40 acres of water meadow, flooded shallow and bright, the old carriers running clear again where Elias had opened them. The flood hatch hung true on its posts, to be worked as his fathers worked it, wide in the wet season, close in the dry. The swifts came back in May and flew low over the water in the evenings, skimming it for the flies that rose off it, the way they had flown the autumn before the flood, when they had flown low and Elias had read the warning in them, and no one had believed him. He was 64 years old. He would not keep the meadow forever. But that was seen to now. For on the wall by the hearth at Ockwell Farm there hung 2 maps that spring, side by side. The old one, Elias Wray's, the linen gone soft and yellow with 40 years, the blue flood line of 1839, as true as the day it dried. And beside it a new one, on clean paper, in a young clear hand, Grace's hand, every carrier and hatch and contour copied fair. The blue line laid down fresh where the old one was fading, so that when the linen finally went, as linen does, the knowledge would not go with it. She had made a copy. She had read the water and drawn it, and put her name to it under her great-grandfather's, so that some Wray not yet born might take it down off the wall some wet autumn 100 years on, and wait it with 4 stones in the dark, and know where to open the gate. That is the whole of it. An old man on the lowest ground, who would not drain his meadow, and was laughed at for it before the whole parish, and drew no sword, and raised no voice, and only kept doing the quiet true thing his fathers had done. Until the water came down off the moor one black night, and settled every account there was to settle, plain, for everyone to read. Some accounts are kept in ink, in ruled columns, in banks and ledgers and clean dry hands, and those are real accounts, and they come due at Michaelmas, and must be paid. But some accounts are kept in water, in willows silvering early, and swifts flying low, and a mark cut chest high on a churchyard stone, and those come due too, in their own time. And they are paid, whether a man can read them or not. The land keeps its books longer than the ledger does. It forgets nothing. It forgives the man who listens, and it does not much trouble itself over the man who laughs. Elias Wray knew that. His father knew it, and his father's father, back to the great water of 1839 and before. And now, a girl of 19 with blistered hands and a clear, steady eye knew it too, and had it written down in her own hand on the wall, waiting, "Water keeps its own accounts." Wherever you're watching from tonight, the town, the valley, the low ground or the high, comment the name of your city below. I'd like to know how far this old man's meadow has travelled.